The Parachute Regiment, one of the British Army's most elite units. Born in the crucible of World War II, they proved themselves time and time again. But Britain's airborne forces didn't spring up overnight. They were forged through a tough regime of rigorous and realistic training that shaped their identity and honed their combat edge. So how did Britain's airborne concept even come about? What sparked the idea in the first place? And how did these men get handpicked for such a formidable task? To help answer those questions and many more, I'm joined by historian Andy Wheel for a deep dive into the 6 airborne divisions build up to D-Day. We'll explore the innovative yet straightforward operational planning, the aggressive leadership style that shaped the division, and the ways in which they overcame limited resources to become a truly effective and highly feared fighting force. Not only that, but we'll look at how those flyboys of the RAF nearly scuppered the whole idea before it began. Think you know everything there is to know about these elite troops? Think again. Andy's an incredible source of knowledge, and like me, you're bound to learn a few things that you never expected. I'll put a link to Andy's book in the video description below. Let's get stuck in.
My interest, my research picks up really, obviously, just on the eve of World War II, and there's a sharp comparison between the development of German airborne forces and British airborne forces, and it all really goes back in a kind of a key way to the Soviet manoeuvres at Kiev in 1936, which was visited by both General Kurt Student of the Luftwaffe and General Archie Wavell, who at the time was General Officer Commanding of 2nd Division based at Aldershot. And essentially, they had 2 completely separate takeaways from seeing those manoeuvres. The Germans very keenly felt that airborne operations could be a key part of their new blitzkrieg approach to warfare, whereas Wavell was far, far more focused on trying to pick up clues and understanding the strengths of Soviet armoured and mechanised forces. That was his key focus. Funnily enough, recently I was revisiting John Frost's memoir books, and one of the points he made was that allegedly, according to John Frost, Archie Wavell came back from Kiev and he told Aldershot Command just to forget about airborne forces because they weren't relevant. So that was it. Airborne forces for the British were parked until the outbreak of World War II. And obviously the Germans had formed 7th Flieger Division in 1938. So they were 3 to 4 years ahead of us in terms of forming a full airborne division. And as World War II started, these airborne troops had been carefully trained. They were supported by the full weight of the Luftwaffe's tactical air power. And they were also furnished with a fleet of 450 Junker 52 transport aircraft. And they enjoyed stunning successes in the invasions of Denmark, Norway, and then the Low Countries, really culminating with the assault and capture of the Airborne fortress in Belgium. In 1914, it had taken the Germans something like 11 days and 60,000 troops and nearly 5,000 casualties to capture those forts, whereas in 1940, they managed it within 48 hours with 414 airborne troops spearheading their attack, which gave you some idea and some impression of the difference that airborne forces could make.
And Andy, what do you think, you touched on it briefly there, but what do you think was the big difference in attitude between the Germans and the British? Was it just that sort of British innate conservatism?
The perceptions of Archie Wavell certainly played a part. Having gone through his papers at Kew, he's keenly interested in the Soviet armour mechanisation, because obviously that was the key strength of the Russian army at that point. As well as their great mass. And I think the airborne forces, as far as he was concerned, were a novelty. They were at best sort of a special effect. And obviously it was quite apparent there'd be a heavy investment in aircraft and specialist training. So I think that was probably more the indication, really.
And then obviously, as you mentioned, the Germans had their great successes, as they swept through Norway, Belgium and France using airborne forces. Was that the catalyst that really made the British take up and notice?
Certainly. I think interestingly, sort of moving to another sort of area of the operations of 1940, Anthony Eden called for the formation of the local defence volunteers, essentially to deal with the threat of German airborne forces. The idea of like the south of England being enveloped by this great wave of highly effective airborne troops ahead of a seaborne landing, and that was the kind of the catalyst of his broadcast that started the formation of the local defence volunteers that then subsequently became the Home Guard. Alan Brooke, who had been the commander of 2nd Corps in the BEF, He returned to the UK and became commander of Southern Command, and then obviously became commander of Home Forces. And he was strongly convinced of their effectiveness, Alan Brooke was, and he was really the champion for British Airborne Forces and their formation all through World War II. And then moving on, the great shock obviously was Crete in May 1941, where Freiburg was sat with 38,000 British and Dominion troops, many very much battle experienced Anzac troops in Crete, with forewarning from ultra decrypts that the Luftwaffe were intending to launch this airborne invasion. And the airborne invasion took place, and horrifyingly, it was a complete success, although the Germans obviously suffered massive casualties, which really put Hitler off large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. But it's interesting looking at Churchill's memoirs for that point. I mean, Churchill's memoirs, obviously, is very much he's cast on the history of World War II, but they are quite frank at that point, and Churchill reflects on conversations he had with Brooke when Crete had fallen, because they just expected the Germans to fill Crete up with bombers, and they were just going to bomb the Royal Navy in Alexandria as a precursor to just dominating the Middle East. So that had a massive effect on British thinking in regard to airborne forces. And that's when things really started to move forward with the formation of 1st Parachute Brigade and then subsequently the Airborne Division.
And I wanted to ask then, how were those early airborne troops chosen? Were they chosen? Were they volunteers? What's the story with that?
They were very much, it very much stemmed from the formation of the Commandos, which is a whole different separate story, really. 2 Commando became 11 SAS Battalion, which then subsequently became 1st Parachute Battalion as an experimental formation to try out these new techniques. And then the volunteers were asked for to form more subsequent parachute battalions. And ultimately, they ended up with enough volunteers to create 2 parachute brigades, 1st and 2nd Parachute Brigades, also with the conversion of a couple of battalions to further fill out the 2nd Brigade. And then moving on from that, by the end of 1941, General Boyd Browning, Major General Boyd Browning as he was then, was appointed the commander of the Airborne Division. It hadn't even been numbered at that point. And then the whole thing really started moving forward. He was a very political, ambitious guardsman, a tremendous career soldier, socially very influential as well. He was married to the extremely popular author Daphne du Maurier. Some of the listeners may have heard of her.
Oh, she wrote Rebecca, didn't she?
She did, yes. And he was very well connected socially. So it was a very astute appointment, really, by Alan Brooke and Paget to create Boyd Browning and make him the commander of airborne forces as a project, and subsequently the division.
Had we seen many clues up until this point, Andy, that he would make a good airborne commander? What was it from his background that you think really lent him to this new type of warfare, essentially?
If you read around Alan Brooke, if you read his diary, if you read his sort of his statements and his writing, Alan Brooke is very much a traditional soldier. And if we were going to have parachute troops, we were going to make sure they were smart and they were well turned out and they drilled and they were highly effective infantry soldiers, as well as being able to do these special techniques to carry out this new form of warfare. And I think he just wanted a very strong, conventional infantry figure, but also it was aggressive, it was active and lively, which Browning certainly was, in terms of driving the whole project forward. And as we'll probably talk in a little while about air resources and a bit of a political inter-service crisis that took place in 1942, which kind of showed that Browning's influence and sort of communicative style could be a double-edged sword.
So, Andy, you touched upon the subject of air resources. What were the big sticking points? What were the problems with regards to those resources?
The key problem really goes back to the formation of British Airborne Forces, in that we didn't really have a bespoke transport plane. The Junkers 52, the Germans had a great advantage of that, in terms of the Junkers 52, for a start, had been like this default aircraft that they'd used before they developed other types, like the Heinkel or the Junkers 88, Heinkel 111. So when these new types were created, the Junker 52s basically went into this pool of transport aircraft available for airborne forces. if you go back to the very early doctrine of British airborne forces, where much smaller operations were considered pre-Crete, very similar to the Ebony Mail assault and the operations that the Germans had carried out against Danish and Norwegian airfields, there was a big focus on capturing airfields, but with much smaller groups of troops, battalions, brigade at the most. So there was a fatal decision made at the very start to try and do airborne operations in terms of air resources on the cheap, which meant that they'd withdraw Bomber Command 2 and 4 engine bomber squadrons to specifically retrain for an operation, and then be used for that airborne operation, then return to their bomber command role. And this also ran in parallel to obviously the RAF Bomber Command's great project based on their Trenchardian theory of the interwar period to generate an enormous heavy bomber force to take the war to Germany and to bomb their cities and win the war that way. And a rift very rapidly developed. In April 1942, Boyd Browning sent a memo directly to Churchill complaining about various obstacles that he felt had been set in the way of the creation of further larger airborne forces. And the key one was the shortage of aircraft. And at the time, all they had was some out-of-date, very vulnerable Whitley bombers, just 2 or 3 squadrons of those. And Churchill read the memo, and that set a hair running, which developed into a real sort of inter-service political problem regarding aircraft resources. Obviously, at that point in the war, this is April 1942, the Allies were under tremendous pressure in the Far East. The Americans had joined the war. A tremendous amount of war production of aircraft and vehicles, which we were expecting, had been diverted to their own troops. And obviously, the war that had erupted in the Far East, and also equipping their divisions ready to go to Europe. Rommel was running right in North Africa. But at the same time, Bomber Bert Harris, was trying to massively build up Bomber Command with an intent of taking the war to the German homeland. And he was completely opposed to the diversion of any of his aircraft or squadrons for airborne forces. And then at that point, the RAF discovered that the army were planning on forming a second airborne division. And the RAF realised that it would take approximately 800 aircraft with the scale of the formations that the army were considering for those 2 airborne divisions at the time, to carry them all into action for a single operation. So this clash took place, and despite Alan Brooke's efforts, because this problem that Browning perhaps had started in a way, it reached a point where there was a war cabinet discussion in October 1942, and Churchill actually halted the further expansion of any more airborne forces. Now, the interesting things that lead off from that is that Alan Brooke was completely wedded to the prospect of airborne forces being used on a significant scale. And obviously, at that point, he was the Commander Imperial General Staff. And he actually said that there was no way he'd disband the airborne division, which is what the RAF were perhaps looking for. And if anything, he'd use them in a light motorised role in North Africa, kind of like a super long-range desert group or SAS, because he was so determined to keep that formation together. But as things played out, there was very much a lot of nifty footwork by Alan Brooke amongst the other chiefs of staff, and he explained, or he perhaps moved the narrative on to say that there'd only be 2 battalions in an air landing brigade rather than the 4 that the RAF had thought there would be. So that meant that the aircraft demand was much, much less. And also at the same time, by November 1942, he'd sent 1st Parachute Brigade to fight in Tunisia to show their worth in combat. And while the paratroopers had some mixed results, but their sort of ferocity and capabilities of infantrymen was certainly shown. And then there was a rejig, and eventually there is a moment in the War Cabinet papers where Portal, the chief of the RAF, announces that there's going to be an enormous equipment, a mass equipment of that aircraft, the C-47, or the Dakota, as we called it, which was going to be used across British forces across the world, really. And there was certainly going to be enough to furnish more transport for British airborne forces. But that was a real political rift, a real moment where the Airborne Forces project almost came unstuck.
And then, so let's go back a little bit and look at the training of these soldiers who had been allocated and volunteered to 6th Airborne Division. What can you tell us? What was the criteria for the men to join the unit? And then what training did they receive once they were accepted?
They were all, essentially, they were all volunteers. The the volunteer program, the method that they decided to follow after the formation, sort of formation of 2nd Parachute Brigade, was a conversion program. Because one thing to bear in mind about the British Army in World War II, it was set up to follow what they called the war plan, which was going to essentially build the army back up to an almost 1918 strength, to a point where it was completely filled out of everybody who's going to do war service by about November 1941. And then together with the French, they were going to crush the Germans a la 1918. Obviously, that didn't happen. And with the threat of Operation Sea Lion, the army just went into sort of survival mode and just generated a tremendous amount of infantry battalions and infantry divisions. And from that, then there was a reworking, moving these infantry battalions into more armoured tank battalions, anti-tank, all sorts of formations like that, including the Airborne division. So there was this tremendous conversion project that went across the board, not just involving Airborne forces, but the troops that were picked for the units that were picked to form the battalions of 6th Airborne Division, apart from the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, which came across from Canada, which was formed of volunteers from their army. Essentially, they were converted battalions, war service battalions, one TA battalion, and the men were offered the choice of whether to stay and take part in the Airborne project, if you like, and do parachute training, become Airborne soldiers, or they could just return to their county regiments effectively. And I did do a little bit of work on the Warwick Battalion, which was converted through to 8th Parachute Battalion under Alistair Pearson. And a lot of airmen went back, and actually many of them ended up in drafts going to other Warwick battalions, and even some other Midland battalions that were actually fighting in North Africa in late 42, early 43. But then all the ranks were filled out with volunteers from across the army, but also from the newly created General Service Corps. Anybody who was conscripted after sort of mid-1942 would go into the General Service Corps, where their aptitudes were tested to find out what role or arm of the army would be best for them. And that's essentially the physical criteria for the parachute troops was perfect eyesight, a good level of fitness, and then obviously that carried them forward into the training. But they were all volunteers. It's interesting reading one memoir about the Devonshire battalion that got converted into the last air landing battalion for 6th Airborne. There is some suggestion by Dudley Anderson that not everybody was 100% a volunteer. So they were told that they were going to become air landing troops, and under the sort of flinty gaze of the sergeant major, and nobody really, according to Dudley Anderson, nobody really had the courage to face up to the sergeant major to say, I don't want to do it. But that's, generally speaking, they were volunteers.
And would they have had a sort of pre-parachute selection course like now, where you have P Company? Was there something similar in those days?
There certainly was, yeah. What they'd have done is they'd have gone to Hardwick Hall for pre-parachute training, which was very tough.
Running, every morning you go up PT. They used to have exercises where one platoon would go to one gate, one out the other. And when you meet, the instructors would say, set upon each other, once with the blood. And then they blow a whistle, and you go past each other, and you come back in the opposite gate.
One of the brigadiers, the brigadier of 3rd Parachute Brigade, James Hill, his nickname was Speedy, and that was based on the fact that he'd make his men march at speed everywhere. And Sunday was particularly tough because the church they went to, or one of the churches they went to, was quite a way away, and they had to speed march there and march back. So the physical demands were tough, and the criteria in terms of they'd then move on to parachute training at Ringway, which is now Manchester Airport.
Parachutist must be able to operate his parachute in the air.
And they'd have to do 8 drops, including a night drop, and a drop which then was followed by a full exercise of ground warfare, infantry tactics. So they were well trained. And then obviously layering on top of that was the work that Windy Gale, General Richard Nelson Gale, the commander of 6th Airborne Division, who'd been the first commander of first Parachute Brigade, he overlaid that as they got ready for D-Day with very specific training. He had 3 focuses of his training, which was tough infantry combat, also including street fighting, which they practiced in the rubble of bombed out Southampton, bridge building and bridge repair, because they all knew that bridges were going to be an issue where they were going to land, or obviously nobody knew apart from a very small number of people later in the day, that it was going to be Normandy and what the objectives would be. And thirdly, combating German mechanized or armored forces, because it didn't take much imagination to understand or appreciate that the great threat came from the Panzer and the Panzer Grenadier divisions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, while we've got Gale on screen here, I think that's probably a really good time to talk about him. Obviously, he's on the front cover of your book. He's a big player. What's his background?
I'm fond of him, I have to admit. So he's a very interesting guy, Richard Gale. It's a difficult way to start with him. He's wrote some history books. He wrote 2 memoirs. He wrote his 6th Airborne memoir, and he also wrote Call to Arms, which is his general army memoir, which is a very interesting read. And I recommend that to anybody to read that who's read his World War II book. He wanted to be a soldier, but interestingly, he's completely candid in his memoir, Call to Arms. He wasn't fit enough in 1914, so he had to boost his fitness. He had to build himself up, essentially, what we'd call today weight training. And then he was fit enough to join the Worcestershire Regiment, and he went through Sandhurst and he was commissioned. And then, interestingly, he arrives on the Western Front, and he says he was interested in machine guns. So he signs up for a machine gun course. When he gets to the newly created Machine Gun Corps, he discovers that he's actually been transferred from the Worcesters to the Machine Gun Corps. And he asks to return to the Worcesters, and he's told to shut up and get on with the job. Anyway, he does very well with the Machine Gun Corps, and I think it's very interesting because they were obviously kind of a new project as far as the army was concerned at the start of World War One. He does very well, and he actually wins the Military Cross in 1918, breaking up German attacks with his machine gun fire, and also releasing some artillery horses that were sort of trapped in their harness that were vulnerable to enemy fire. What happens then is he moves on. He stays in the army. He's a regular. So he actually ends up on the northwest frontier with the Machine Gun Corps. The Machine Gun Corps is disbanded. He goes back to the Worcesters. Then he does Staff College. And then, this is really interesting kind of sliding doors moment in a way. He's actually in 2nd Division with one of the battalions when Wavell goes in 1936 to see the Kiev manoeuvres. So it's quite interesting to think that more than likely Gale perhaps was well aware of what Wavell had done and Wavell's views on airborne forces. But then he did very well. He pursued his staff side of his army career, and he was writing training pamphlets. And when 1940 took place, he ended up commanding a battalion of the Leicester Regiment, a TA battalion. And it kind of shows you the all hands to the pump situation that the army was in 1941, creating these battalions. So he did that, and obviously he'd gained a reputation. He'd met some key figures in the army that were in sort of important positions of authority at that point. He'd met Brooke. He'd talked to Brooke while creating infantry training. He was known to be a very strong trainer. So that's how he got the job at 1st Parachute Brigade. And then, but from that point on, he had his experience, and he carried it forward. I think the photograph that's on the front of my book and the photograph that you've got up now, I think is very interesting because he's an old soldier from World War One. And I think that's, bearing in mind his division is essentially very fit but green, inexperienced soldiers. I think he tried to radiate that in his command. Quite often you see photographs of him, he's bareheaded. And if you think about the environment that he was working in, Airborne Forces HQs, almost certainly everybody would be wearing a maroon beret or a steel helmet. So there's this imposing figure. You can see him in the picture. He's got his World War One artillery glasses around his neck. He's got his cigarette on the go. He's bareheaded so everybody can see him. He's wearing his World War One jodhpurs in a lot of the photographs where he's doing training. And he was quite an imposing sight. And then he went after 1st Parachute Brigade. He's quite sad, I think, to give up the command of 1st Parachute Brigade. But then he went into the role of Director of Air at the War Office, where he was also a very good communicator at all levels. And there's a photograph in my book of him standing in a very Eisenhower-esque, sharp number 1 uniform with his red tabs. And you can see that's how he'd have operated at that level with, service heads and other important figures. But he was certainly a soldier. Lord Lovat said that when he initially encountered Gale, he thought he was red-faced and he had a loud, hectoring voice. Later, he learned to really respect him. So that was kind of how he took people, really, when you encountered him.
So we've talked about how the men ended up in the airborne forces. What was the situation with officers, and how were officers chosen for service with the unit, and then within the unit, how were they allocated to their different roles?
Well, once Gale had been appointed to 6th Airborne Division, because he had this sort of strong, almost guru status as a key figure in the formation of the whole Airborne Forces project, he had quite a lot of control over appointments and so on. And these battalions of conventional role war service infantry that had been converted into airborne troops, by and largely all the commanding officers were replaced, bar one really, in terms of the parachute battalions. There's 4 interesting characteristics that come through in the appointment of commanders for 6th Airborne Division. First and foremost, they usually were an airborne volunteer or existing member, an existing officer of like the airborne fraternity. And that was something like 6 out of 7 of the battalion commanders had that characteristic. Then a tremendous number of them were regular infantrymen, which makes complete sense because you want a regular infantryman in charge of your infantry battalion once it's landed. And then there was a general requirement for those that were outside the airborne fraternity that they were keen on airborne forces. And 10th Somerset Light Infantry, which became the 7th Battalion, their CO, Reggie Parker, was very keen. And he ended up being second in command of the Air Landing Brigade, and would have quite an important role in Gale's plan in command of Parker Force, which never really got off the ground, which was an idea to use limited armoured and mobile forces that 6th Airborne had in a role once they're in the perimeter in Normandy. And then the other person was a company commander, A.P. Johnson, who became the commander from 10 Somerset Light Infantry, became the commander of one of the other airborne battalions. So, and the other criteria was what they'd a World War I term, which was a thruster, which was somebody who's like just a general strong get up and go. And if you go through my book, most of the commanders had this characteristic, obviously, but probably the best sort of non-airborne fraternity character who exhibited this sort of aggressive liveliness was Tony Teacher. And he was the commander of 53 Worcestershire Yeomanry, which became the light artillery regiment for the air landing for the airborne division. And he'd made quite a name for himself in 1943 during an exercise called Exercise Spartan, which was a big exercise, big home exercise, practicing all sorts of troops. And at the time, he used 53 Worcestershire Yeomanry was actually an anti-tank regiment equipped with new 17-pounder guns. And he used his own regiment, and he also attached anti-aircraft elements and other field elements. And in terms of the exercise, according to the umpires, he inflicted this crushing defeat on the Guards Armoured Division, which they weren't very happy about.
Sure.
If you want to know more about that, there's a guy called Timothy Harrison Place who wrote a very interesting book about the training of the British Army, and he touches on that. But he was seen as a real useful live wire, and obviously, and he ended up in the mix. But those characteristics, regular infantryman, thruster, keen on airborne forces, or already a member of the airborne fraternity, that was the key characteristics of these guys who were picked to be battalion commanders in 6th Airborne Division.
Andy will be back again very soon for the second part of this chat, where we'll look at the division's role on D-Day and the tough fight that followed but is often forgotten. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, and if you love military history, watch the video that's on screen now.